Welcome to Laptop Radio. Today's topic is carbon removal on the blockchain, and we have Paul Gambill with us. He is the CEO and co-founder of Nori. Hello, Paul. How are you?
Hi, Michelle. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me here.
Where are you
I,
located?
I'm located in Seattle.
Awesome. Awesome. I love Seattle. I miss Seattle. I haven't been there for years.
Well, this is the kind of utopian period of the year, the really nice time when you do want to come visit Seattle in August.
I have really good memories of Seattle, but today we're going to talk about carbon removal, which I'm really excited about. I have talked a lot about green because I just feel like it's really important to preserve the world. Let me ask you, what is your story?
Well, I've lived in Seattle for about 10 years. I moved here after I finished grad school. I studied computer engineering and then got my master's in engineering management. And it was while I was in grad school that I learned from a professor about Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And I really don't know how he first heard about it because that was in 2010. So it was really early. And then I moved to Seattle. I started working at software agencies. We were building mobile apps for big like Fortune 500 brands
Mhm.
and primarily at Deloitte Digital. And then after the projects stopped being so interesting in about 2014, I left the company and I started a couple other businesses that didn't really go anywhere. And then in 2015, I was looking for something new and bigger and better to work on. And climate change seemed like kind of an obvious choice because, of course, more people are going to care about this in the future. And I wanted to work on something that would attract a lot of really talented people to join me. And I was approaching it from an engineering mindset of thinking, okay, well, the problem with climate change is that there are too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so the solution is pull them back out. And I was wondering, why aren't we doing that? Why isn't that like the thing that people are talking about? This is in 2015. We didn't even have the term carbon removal at the time because it was really early. And I started a meetup group in Seattle to find other people interested in this. I wanted to
Mhm.
learn more. I didn't have like an environmental science background.
Mhm.
And after about a year and a half, well, one, we had met basically every group in the world that was working on carbon removal because there were so few. And two, what I thought was going to be like kind of a deep tech problem, we just needed to develop new and better, more technological ways of pulling carbon out. Isn't so much that, it's more we know large scale ways of pulling carbon out of the air, but they're not happening at any scale. And it's not a tech problem, it's an incentives problem. There's not enough of a financial incentive for people to pull carbon out of the air. And then around the end of 2016 was when we started to see the rise of tokenization in the Ethereum space. And that was like the light bulb moment for me that, like, okay, there's this missing financial incentive for pulling carbon out of the air. And here is this amazing technology that can create new financial incentives from nothing that I've been equally passionate about for 6 years at that point. So, how about we put them together and use crypto economics to create new financial incentives for pulling carbon out of the air?
That's awesome. And what is that aha moment though? When you're first building the platform, you thought of using blockchain, which is pretty new at the time. How do you thought of using the blockchain on the back end?
Uh-huh.
And how do you structure the incentives?
Yeah. Well, so there was this one moment when one of the members in that meetup group I had started was a carbon offsets broker. He was sharing with me information from the industry. And there's really only one group that at the time did market analysis of the carbon offsets market. So it's called the Forest Trends State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Report. And I was looking in this and I was trying to understand how much money are people actually spending on carbon offsets? How big is this potential market? And the way that they calculate that is based off of the total number of sales of carbon credits. If I generate carbon credits and I sell them to you, and then you sell them to someone else, and then that person sells them to someone else, this report was counting every single one of those sales. And I thought, well, that's kind of crazy. Why would you do that? The only sale that matters is the first one. Everything that comes after that is just pushing a piece of paper around. So that for me was like an aha moment, like, oh, carbon credits are double counted, triple counted, quadruple counted. Why on earth does it work that way? It just seemed totally insane. And that led to the realization that the way these carbon credit markets work is the original market designers wanted a tradable commodity asset that people could invest in and buy low, sell high kind of strategy on them, because that's good overall. You want commodities markets to help with price discovery and with price transparency and to help businesses forecast and make financial plan possible around that. So that's like a good intention, but in practice, it means that you're selling the same ton of CO2 over and over and over again. And what we wanted to do from the very beginning was separate that out and say, look, when you sell carbon to a new buyer, that buyer owns it forever. They should not be able to resell it, but we still need a tradable commodity asset. We've actually separated these out. There's the carbon certificate, which is actually just recorded as an NFT on chain. And so we can prove who owns it in a very transparent way on the ledger. And then there's a Nori token where the price of 1 ton of CO2 will always be 1 token. And that token price will fluctuate based on supply and demand. But then it's also publicly transparent on chain. That's the important role that the blockchain plays for solving these double counting problems.
Awesome. When you're designing the model, you would think about incentives for people to remove carbon. What are some factors that you thought through on incentivizing the community when they participate in the mission of the startup?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of different ways to pull carbon out of the air. There are more nature-based solutions. What we're working on primarily right now is what's called regenerative agriculture. Farmers changing their farming practices and storing carbon in their
Really
soil.
cool.
They're planting trees, everyone's familiar with that, growing kelp. And then there are more industrial approaches like direct air capture, carbon negative cement, and storing carbon in construction materials. And some of those industrial methods are extremely expensive. The estimates for direct air capture is something on the order of like $600 to over $1,000 per ton is the cost to actually extract that CO2 from the air. When we're thinking about like an incentives side of thing to your question, the price that buyers are willing to pay for carbon offsets today is not sufficiently high enough to incentivize these more expensive methods. But it is high enough to incentivize regenerative agriculture or potentially forestry. If we expect over time that the cost of these expensive industrial methods will come down, just in the same way that solar energy costs have come down, how do we build the market so that it kind of meets them in the middle? Basically, carbon removal and carbon offsetting as an industry is very much supply constrained. There is nowhere near enough supply to meet the total demand as it exists today, but also certainly as it exists in 5 to 10 years. So we have to figure out how to make it more affordable and easier for people to generate supply. And the best way to do that is to help increase their margins. Our whole concept is by revealing what the price that the market is willing to pay actually is, it makes it easier for suppliers to enter into that market and start participating. And we eventually want to see people proposing new methods of carbon removal to us that are now suddenly possible because they're able to get paid for it.
That's awesome. What do you think is more effective, though, to reward people based on their emission or their action? You cannot drive and take the bus or fly. You can also plant trees. Which of them do you think is more effective?
Well, if we're truly saying all else being equal, whether you're comparing avoiding emissions versus removing past emissions, it's definitely more effective to avoid new emissions because the carbon that is being extracted in the form of fossil fuels, it's already in a stable form underground. Like it's best to just leave it there. However, in practice, that becomes difficult, almost to the point of impossible to prove a counterfactual. This is a problem called additionality in carbon offsetting, which is to say, how do you know that if someone is doing a project and they're saying, as a result of this project, I'm emitting less CO2 than I otherwise would have? How do you prove that? That's really challenging in some cases. And it's very easily gameable. There are lots and lots of frauds throughout history of people, you just get the right like verifier or regulator to support what it is that you're doing. And we've seen, for instance, lots of fraud around avoided deforestation credits, which is someone saying, hey, I own this forest. It's at risk of being cut down because I need to make revenue from it. But I'll tell you what, I won't cut it down if you pay me to keep the carbon locked up. Sounds good in theory, but it doesn't always work that way in practice. So that's difficult. Then on the carbon removal side, I think it's a far more intuitive transaction because we basically take a baseline, someone is doing some sort of work or labor, and as a result of that project, carbon is coming out of the air and being stored somehow in the earth. That is a lot easier to measure, and it's a lot easier to prove that what they've done is, air quotes, additional to that. So I think from an accounting perspective, carbon removal is a lot easier, but overall, yeah, I mean, it's definitely better for people to avoid emitting in the first place.
Yeah, but no one's gonna avoid it if they're not incentivized to do it unless they're really, really conscious.
Right. Yeah. And relying on altruism is not a way to solve this problem. That just cannot scale. So we have to figure out, how do we make it possible for everyone to make a profit off of pulling carbon out of the air? That's what Nori is doing.
How do you count a carbon offset? What does the economics look like?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so the way this works for us is we have one methodology so far and plan to add many more, where the methodology is for storing carbon in soils in the US. So these are farmers in America who are adopting regenerative practices like no-till or reducing their tillage. They're planting cover crops, they're implementing more complex crop rotations and so on. And the product that we sell is called a Nori removal ton, or NRT. And one NRT is 1 ton of CO2 removed and sequestered. And so to make an NRT, the farmers first have to provide operating data to us. This is like what kind of crops they're growing, where their fields are located, the level of tillage, fertilizer applied, and so on. And then that data has to be verified by an independent third party. So there are 50 companies in the world, and they're accredited to various ISO and ANSI standards, and they do verification for these existing carbon offset registries. And so we're working with the same people. And what they're doing is they're checking how accurate is that data that the farmers are providing. So they're doing like an audit spot check on things, like might be looking at invoices and receipts for seed or fertilizer purchases. They might look at satellite imagery to verify that, yes, you were growing that particular crop on that field in that year. And then they're also checking that the farmer has the title to do this, because most farmers do not own their land. So we have to make sure that the landowner is okay with this kind of commitment. Lastly, checking that the farmers aren't double selling this through any other offset registry or something like that, that this is truly unique. The verifiers sign off on it, and we take that operating data and we run it through a third-party partner, that what we call a carbon quantification tool. We're relying on outsourced, peer-reviewed, open source science to turn that operating data into a number that says, based on the practices that you've adopted, this is how much carbon you're putting in the ground relative to what would have happened if you had just continued with the conventional farming practices on that same field. And so we do that with a company that's called Soil Metrics, which is a spin out from Colorado State University, where they have a platform there that's been funded by the US Department of Agriculture for decades. And so that's really like the federal government's greenhouse gas accounting tool, is what we rely upon for determining the amount of carbon that goes in there. So once the quantification is done and the verification is done, then we can generate the NRTs, and then those farmers can sell them to buyers, who are typically businesses that are trying to offset their carbon footprints.
Awesome. That's really cool. Is your target audience mostly farmers?
On the supply side, yeah, for now it is mostly farms. In the future, we want to add other methodologies. And so there are companies that are growing kelp, and they're growing kelp to remove carbon. And there are companies that are making carbon negative cement. And there are these direct air capture companies as well. And so we just need some sort of scientifically verifiable way of measuring how much carbon is being removed relative to a baseline. And that's what we need to get started with, adding new methodologies. So that's what we'll be doing over the next handful of years.
How do you know if carbon is removed? You can't see it, right?
You can't see it, you can't smell it. So we have to often do modeling based on what's happening. When it comes to the soil, the way that that USDA program works is they have a reference network of 1,200 different sites around the US where they do rigorous soil sample testing. So they'll take a tube of soil out from the ground and they'll do spectroscopy on it. So you can look and see all of the different physical elements that are in there. And then you can run that through other models, including like weather data and soil type maps and that kind of thing. And all of that together can come back and say, okay, the baseline scenario is if you had continued with conventional practices like heavy tillage, lots of fertilizer, and so on. And then relative to that, this is how much carbon you've stored.
Mhm. What is the significance of carbon though? Why do we have it in the first place? And what is carbon?
The carbon cycle is basically millions of years ago as organic matter, dinosaurs, but lots of other organic matter, I think mostly bacteria and other things, decomposed under intense pressure. Like all living organic matter is made of carbon. We're made of lots of carbon as humans. And so a lot of that lives underground in the form of petroleum and as a way to fuel the industrial revolution through oil and coal and natural gas and so on. We've extracted a lot of that carbon that was previously locked up and we've burned it and then released it into the atmosphere, which then causes the greenhouse gas effect, which is causing climate change. If we want to solve climate change and we want to reduce the global warming that's going on, we should pull that carbon back out and store it, lock it up somehow. But we're talking about massive, massive amounts of CO2, like somewhere on the order of 1.5 trillion with a T tons of CO2. That's metric tons. So a lot of carbon needs to be pulled out. Now, the nice thing is with these farming practices, the farmers actually benefit from having increased carbon in their soil because that increased carbon is actually in the form of organic matter like microbes and fungi. And that can actually help with water retention, whether they're going through a drought or flooding, they're going to be a little bit better off. And it also means that they don't need to buy as much fertilizer. And fertilizer is very expensive for the farm, but also the production of fertilizer produces a lot of carbon emissions. So on the back end, we're also reducing other carbon emissions elsewhere, which is pretty cool too. And over time, farmers who do these practices will eventually see higher crop yields so they can make their land more profitable. It's all around a really good, smart thing to do. The problem is that they don't necessarily see those benefits kick in really until maybe 5 or 7 years after they started. And it's a difficult period of transition in such a low margin business like farming. Turns out carbon payments is a really great way to help them get through that sort of financial valley of death.
Mm-hmm. How long does it take then? 5 to 7 years just to see some kind of result. But does it take 7 billion people to remove carbon so that there's some impact?
Well, what we're trying to do is saying there are all sorts of reasons why someone might want, or a company might want to pay for removing carbon from the atmosphere, but doesn't have the ability to do so themselves. And so the more liquid that we can make that type of market and make it easy to connect those types of buyers with suppliers like farmers, then the more carbon that will come out of the air. So that's where we're trying to play, is right in the middle of that. And long term on the demand side, we're trying to be something like Stripe for carbon removal payments. So e-commerce merchants integrating this in, and maybe into like transportation companies and airlines and that sort of thing.
Got it. Become a vertical for carbon.
Yeah. But ultimately, 1.5 trillion tons is such a large number. It sort of boggles the mind to really contemplate like how big that actually is. So the only way that we can ever really make significant progress on climate change is if this is taken on in a bottom-up way. We have to integrate carbon removal to be automatic into literally everything that we do. There's actually a good analog to this, which is how we deal with garbage. When you go into a restaurant or something and you produce a bunch of garbage waste, when you get your bill at the end of the meal, there's not a garbage removal line item in that check. It's just built into the cost of doing business, right? Well, we've never had the tools to do the same thing with carbon because, as you said, we can't see it, we can't smell it, but we now finally have the ability to do that. And that's how this will evolve over time.
Why use the blockchain instead of a database?
A couple of reasons. One is solving that double counting problem. We need to have two different assets that can do this. And we need to be able to prove that it's not been resold. And blockchains are just infinitely better as a public ledger, as a public database. They're much better at that than a private database that's controlled by a centralized actor. Anyone can go audit this. So anyone today can go to nori.com and go look at NRTs that have been sold and then can verify that on the blockchain. And then they can trace that back to who did the removal and the verifier's report that they submitted for that. So the more transparency here, the more that people are going to trust it. And trust is the most important factor in carbon removal and growing this industry.
Yeah, trust seems to be really important, especially for something that you can't even see.
Yeah, there's no other way around it. It's the most important aspect.
And is there anything else that you would like to share that I have not asked you?
Well, actually, we're doing this radio interview. And for people who are curious to learn more, we have a couple podcasts that we publish very regularly about this industry. One is called Reversing Climate Change, and the other is called Carbon Removal Newsroom, which is more of a current events like panel feature. So if you want to learn more, that's, I think, a great way to start dipping into this burgeoning carbon removal industry, because it is small and mighty and growing very fast.
If someone is interested in carbon removal and they wanted to learn more or just really take the first step, how do they even begin?
Well, I would start with one of our podcasts, but there are other groups out there that are really good at this. There's a group called Air Miners. And Air Miners is a community of people who are organized around carbon removal in a kind of a decentralized way. They do a lot of self-education stuff with this like boot camp to quickly learn about all these different methods. There are different entrepreneurs that are hanging out in there looking for co-founders, trying to start new companies about carbon removal. So Air Miners is a great place to start. And then there's another organization called Carbon 180, which is more of a like policy think tank based out of DC. And they're a good way to learn about what's happening at the national level and international level regarding policy stuff.
What interests you about carbon and removing carbon? I know that you've been involved in the community and organizing a lot of these carbon removal Seattle, but deep down, what really inspired you to be part of this movement?
I just don't want to have to care about climate change anymore, especially when I was thinking about this in 2015. Like the only ways people discussed this was in a political context, was like the government should do this or shouldn't do this other thing or something like that. And like that's such a waste of time. And governments have had decades to do something about climate change and they've completely failed at doing anything. And so I just want to see this go away. I live in Seattle. I like to ski. I like to hang out on the water in the summers. Like everything about what I love in Seattle is the relation to the environment around us. I would still like to be able to ski in the Cascade Mountains in 50 years. That would be really nice for there to still be enough snowpack to do that. But even selfishly, I just want to see climate change not be a thing that is causing a problem anymore. That's such a small individual level. At the more global level, climate change is already causing all sorts of geopolitical problems. It's causing wars, it's causing famines and droughts. And there's a massive amount of human suffering that is already happening and will happen because of climate change. And if we can solve this problem, then we don't have to have that amount of suffering.
But is climate change real?
Yes, of course. In terms of like, are humans emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that's causing a warming effect on the planet? Yeah, that's been pretty well established for a long time. The question then becomes, what do we do about it? And I think there is this political divide. Most environmentalist groups and people involved in the policy side of this come from the left, and they're often advocating for policy solutions that aren't really palatable to people on the right. And there's this concept in psychology called solution aversion, which is to say, if you tell me that there is a problem about something and then you propose a solution to me, but I don't like the consequences of that solution, then it's just a very human thing to push back and say, actually, I don't think that's a problem. Even if it is actually a problem and it's just maybe there would be a different, better solution that you would go along with. So that seems to be what's happening, at least in the US, around these political divides. And what Nori is actually trying to do here is bridge that gap and say, look, solving climate change doesn't have to mean that we transform our economy in a socialistic way. I'm just using the worst case example. This is going to require heavy investment and business creation and growth and job creation and so on that can actually help grow the economy. So if we can offer ways for people to make money off of pulling carbon out of the air, then that can bring in people who might have otherwise politically been predisposed not to participate.
Awesome. And in terms of your community, if people are interested, how do they find the community?
I mentioned those podcasts, Reversing Climate Change, Carbon Removal Newsroom. That's like the easiest way to engage with what Nori is doing. But you can also just go to nori.com. And if you care about this personally, then you can just right there on the homepage, pay for removing your average carbon footprint. If you work at a company that is concerned about its carbon footprint and you want to become more sustainable for your customers, then get in touch with us. All of that's available directly just at nori.com. Pretty easy to find there. I would just encourage people to be thinking about what are the different ways in which you could integrate carbon removal into your life automatically so that you don't have to think about it in the same way that we've integrated garbage removal into our lives. How are those equivalent?
You know how people really hate throwing away their trash.
Yeah.
What is your vision for the next 5 years?
It's certainly going to be scaling up on the supply side. We're only able to work with farmers in the US right now because that carbon quantification tool is reliant upon data in the US, but we want to expand to other parts of the world. There are lots of other countries around the world that have larger regenerative agriculture communities. And then we want to start adding additional methodologies, as I mentioned. And in the near term, we're actually planning to launch our token, the Nori token, later this year in the fall, because up until now, the buyers have been transacting in cash. And so we've been trying to get the carbon side of the business working from end to end before we layered in the crypto and financial side. That's coming. Over the next 5 years, I would expect more growth on the different types of methodologies, locations of people who are removing carbon, just more throughput. When it comes to KPI, the most important one at Nori is how much carbon is being pulled out of the air, because our revenue comes from a transaction fee that we charge to the buyer. So we only make money when carbon's coming out of the air.
Mm-hmm. And what is one piece of advice that you would have for the community?
I just want to see more carbon removal entrepreneurs. Think about what are the ways in which you can build innovative business models for pulling carbon out of the air. Is there some way you can build a physical product that pulls carbon out and provides some other value to people? Is there a way you can contribute just by making memes about carbon removal? I think it can vary widely here, but try to incorporate carbon removal and that concept into your daily life, because I think a lot of people just aren't even aware that it's possible to pull large amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We are not doomed to a fate here. We have the ability to take action that can solve the problem and make it become a non-issue. We don't have to despair over this, but we have to start innovating.
Awesome. We'll start making memes.
Yeah, make more carbon removal memes. I would like to see those, please. I want stuff to share on Twitter.
Share them on Twitter.
Yeah.
On the Nori is Nori on Twitter. So, thank you, Paul.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
Thank you. Bye-bye.